Hey guys, Dr. Stitzel here. So in this video, we're going to talk about political economy. The question is, if economists know free markets and competition is best, then why do we have price controls, tariffs, bad government policy, high inflation, etc.? If you've been paying attention in this class, then you know the answer is that incentives matter. The answer to this for economists, an important part of the study of political economy, is what we call public choice. Public choice is the study of political behavior with the tools of economics. Put another way, decision makers maximize their own well-being. We treat politicians, bureaucrats, policymakers as economic agents who are trying to maximize their own well-being. For politicians, for example, they want political standing or re-election. They're therefore most responsive to special interest groups. That's how we get many bad policies. We'll talk about this more later. But for this video, I'm going to focus on representative governance. So we won't be talking about monarchies or dictatorships. We're going to be talking about democracy and democratic republics, etc. The first place we should start with any type of discussion of this nature is with voters. And unfortunately, with voters, we have to face a somewhat unsettling truth, which is voters are rationally ignorant. So rational ignorance is when the benefits of being informed are less than the costs of becoming informed. Let's take an example from class. Suppose in this class, instead of giving you the grade that you earn on your individual quizzes and individual exams, I give you the average of everyone's performance on each assignment. Should you study more? Well, if you study more and you're graded individually, then say an extra hour of studying will raise your exam grade by 10 points. Those are your 10 points. The problem is if you're graded against the other 50 students in the class, then those 10 points are really just a fifth of a point, 10 divided by 50, because your behavior is only 1/50th of your total grade. Political knowledge happens the same way. For example, let's consider a couple of common survey questions. Think to yourself, do you know the current Speaker of the House? Do you know the current song of the year? Even if you got those questions right, think about which you'd be more comfortable betting on if I surveyed a random person at the mall tomorrow. Another common survey question is, what are the two biggest areas of government spending? 41% of people choose welfare, whereas the right answers are defense and social security. If you look at that list, those are 6 very big areas of spending, and we would think a lot of people would guess a lot of wrong answers there. It's just generally the case that voters aren't incentivized very well to have a lot of information about what it is that they're voting about. Think about it this way. If you have a particular cost of holding a particular opinion, for example, you have a group of friends around you who are very passionate about a particular policy, then going against what your friends hold is very high cost to you, but your vote on the margin does very little in any particular election, meaning that you don't have much incentive to be right. You have much more incentive to minimize your cost about holding a particular set of opinions. Rational ignorance has several costs. The first cost is just that uninformed choices, since no individual voter has much incentive to be highly informed, you get uninformed choice in total. Let's take a good example of minimum wage. What percentage of people do you suppose in the U.S. economy are at or below minimum wage? When I do this exercise in class, I generally get answers between 10 and 50%. The real answer is less than 2%. Less than 2%. It's about 2% of wage earners, which doesn't include salaried individuals who probably make up almost half of the economy. So we're looking at something in the ballpark of 1%. There's a lot of other characteristics there, but just in general, regardless of your opinion about minimum wage, which hopefully we've set up very nicely elsewhere in this class, so I won't reinforce it, it just isn't a very big topic. Second, we end up with a lot of biased or uninformed decisions. These are identified in 4 major categories by economist Bryan Caplan in his book Myth of the Rational Voter. The first is anti-market bias, which underestimates the benefits of markets, especially to economic outcomes. That has essentially been one of the major themes in this course, so I won't reiterate much of that here. Second is anti-foreign bias, which underestimates the benefits of interacting with foreigners. The main outcome of this is we should learn that international trade is good. I covered this in the video called Elemental Case for Free Trade by economist Don Boudreaux. If you still have this bias, I encourage you to review that video. But what I want to focus on are these next two biases. The first is the make-work bias. This is possibly the strongest bias among voters, which is the bias to underestimate the benefits of conserving labor. Generally, we are encouraged to vote for or support politicians who will forward proposals that, quote, create jobs. Now, for an individual, having a job is important, but for society, having individuals actually do productive things is what's important. Economists have been at war with make-work bias for centuries. A good example of this would be the classic Sisyphism. If you remember the story of Sisyphus, who is cursed to roll a boulder up a hill for the rest of eternity, this would be work. This would be the perfect make-work opportunity. Effort itself constitutes and measures wealth, but to progress in the case of an economy, you have to increase the ratio of result to effort. So you actually want more done with less, that is to conserve labor. Productivity is the backbone of wealth. If you were taking a macroeconomics course, which this is not, one of the principal things I would be trying to teach you is that productivity is wealth, not a stock of money, not a stock of goods. The ability to produce things with fewer and fewer resources is what makes a nation, a people, an individual wealthy. In the case of labor, it is a resource, so conserving it makes people better off. So what we want to do is be careful of make-work biases. Classic example of this is the fear of the machine or technology, thinking that will crowd out jobs. And in some way, there will be certain jobs that will be crowded out, but the actual effect will be an increase in productivity and an increase in wealth. The second bias that I want to talk about, the fourth bias overall, is the pessimism bias. This overestimates the severity of economic problems and underestimates the performance of the economy. We see this all around. A common case of this is in cultural settings where every generation thinks the next generation after them, their children and their grandchildren, are worse off and are somehow losing touch with the things that previous generations have learned. We romanticize the past and we fear the future. It's worth noting that we should remember that economies in the past, present, and future tend to, or almost always, overperform the expectations of a people at a particular time. The third problem with rational ignorance is that not everyone is rationally ignorant. In this case, we specifically mean special interest groups. Why are special interest groups not rationally ignorant, and how do we know that? It's because they hire lobbyists, and they work specifically to target when their issues are going to come up. Industries are rationally informed rather than rationally ignorant, and they take advantage of this by trying to shape policy. Remember, we said early on, politicians, policymakers, bureaucrats, etc., they are self-interested. They are interested in their own well-being. In a market setting, someone being interested in their own well-being means that they have to offer you a product or a service that benefits you, which is what we mean by mutually beneficial exchange. In a government setting, there's no such promise, and in fact, things that happen in the political sphere often come at the expense of certain groups of people, benefiting other groups of people. This leads to the political success formula. This means to diffuse costs and to concentrate benefits. What I want to do is cause everyone to pay a little bit more in taxes and then give a particular group, we see lots of cases of this. Farm subsidies is one of the most common cases, but subsidies to any number of industries, any types of groups, right? Education spending is really common. The list would go on and on. I'm not singling out any particular industry. I think we'd have a hard time thinking of an industry that probably doesn't have some type of reach in this case. And those people are very loud and very supportive, and it doesn't do much to deter your reelection chances if the costs are very diffuse. Now, one of the other ways that voters show their ignorance is through myopia. And this really comes to the surface when we realize that business cycles determine elections. That is, incumbents win when the economy is doing well. Economist Ray Fair has a model that accurately predicts, as accurately as any exit poll, as any type of other model that predicts elections, simply using what the economy looks like leading up to the election. Dr. Fair says voter share depends on the growth rate, so how the economy is growing, inflation, how many quarters, so any group of 3 months within a year, you would qualify as good news, right? So when economic measurements come out, they come out every quarter. If those numbers are good, then lots of stories get written about how the economy is going well. What president is running, so the incumbent or non-incumbent, and how long it is that individual has been in office. So you can see here, I love that in his book he titles this chapter, "It's the Economy, Stupid." You probably can't write academic books like that anymore. The FAIR model has been borne out over time. It's still used to this day, and in fact, some of my colleagues here even have some work on expanding the FAIR model to make it even more accurate. But be sure when election cycle comes around to take a look at the FAIR model in predicting elections. You can see here there's a very, very strong relationship between what voter share goes to the incumbent and what the growth rate is. If the growth rate is very low, right, so notice that we have a couple of really big negative downturns, recessions here, and those correspond with extremely low voter share, the lowest of all cases in this case. And when we see very huge growth, right, so our normal growth would be something like 2%. When we see 10%, landslide victory over 60% for the incumbent, and you can see there's a very strong pattern and correlation here. Notice that it's almost a one-to-one return. So for those of us who haven't looked at our statistics in a minute, this is a one-to-one return between voter share and growth rate. You can actually see that pretty neatly by this being a 45-degree line. The T statistic here, usually 1.95 or so, is what we count as statistically significant. In this case, we have 4.5, so very tight estimate here. Okay. The next idea that we want to talk about is the median voter theorem. This is when voters vote for the policy that is closest to their ideal, as expressed on a straight line. Then the ideal point of the median voter will beat any other policy in a majority rule election. Basically, what this is saying is think about any particular policy issue as a spectrum, right? So here I've drawn a line to represent a spectrum. Suppose we want to do like more spending and less spending on a straight line, and the voters are A, B, C, D, and E. And let's consider for a second, well, first, what's the median voter? Well, the median voter is C. Notice that's not the average, it's the median, right? So our voters that are to the left of C are A and B, and to the right are D and E. That makes C the median voter. So in a situation where we just have the candidates listed in blue, the Democrat and the Republican, say, which one will get the majority election? Well, whoever it is that is closest to a voter will get their vote. So we see that B is closest to D, A is closest to D, E is closest to R, and D is closest to R. But the important thing is that C is closest to R. So the median voter theorem shows us that we don't need to know all the different voters. If we know which one's the median voter, whoever they're closest to will end up winning. Let's imagine a scenario now where a second Democratic candidate jumps in, and they're a little bit closer actually to C. What will they do? They'll end up getting C and D and E and then taking the election. The median voter theorem then is very important in helping us understand how it is that people will vote. Now this has also a very general application in addition to the somewhat narrow application that I'm showing here, which is to say if you have a situation where a candidate or any set of policies can be evaluated in this manner, you will also see the same outcomes. The median voter is the only thing that matters in some sense. How do we know this? Well, suppose for a second that A moved and E moved, and we just see this shifting of extreme outcomes, but C doesn't move, right? So the centrist, the independent, they stay where they are, but the people on the right and the left, they move away from the center. Well, if C doesn't move, the outcomes won't move. So how it is that these guys move around, that matters. But if they don't change, right, ceteris paribus, if they don't change, the median voter won't allow other things to change either. Okay, let's introduce one last idea. The median voter theorem has an important implication, which is that there's no such thing as a stable political equilibrium if you're not dealing with just one particular issue. Anytime you're dealing with a politician or an election that represents multiple issues, it's very easy to get away from a situation where any one particular policy can be stable, can be the what in game theory we would call the dominant outcome. How do we know this? Well, if you end up in a situation where you have more than one issue at play, it's probably very unlikely that there is a median voter for all of the issues simultaneously. Let's think of this in a simpler example. Suppose we're trying to decide who the greatest heavyweight boxer of all time is, and we look at Muhammad Ali, Lennox Lewis, and Mike Tyson. If Lewis defeats Ali, and Tyson defeats Lewis, but Ali defeats Tyson, how do we know who the greatest ever is? Well, in that case, we don't have a good answer. It's easy to think of in a similar sense. Once we deal with multiple policy issues, we can have the same kind of outcome for an election. This leads us to what's known as Arrow's impossibility theorem. So economist Kenneth Arrow has a very important contribution to political economy, and he says when voters have 3 or more options, no ranking system can convert the individual's rankings into community rankings. So it's important that we're talking about the idea ranking here, because what this means is this is just an ordinal ranking, saying I prefer X to Y, Y to Z, and so on, and not saying something about the intensity of your preference. So I prefer X to Y twice as much as I prefer Y to Z is not included in this. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on how you view it, Arrow is actually talking about ranking systems, which represents most of our actual voting. We simply pick A versus B, or we pick, in some cases you might pick A and B compared to C, pick 2 of the 3 options, something like that. Any of those fall under Arrow's idea. So the problem is he's saying there's no way if you have 3 or more options for a ranking system to actually consistently convert individual rankings into community rankings. Notice what I'm not saying. I'm not saying there is no way for any voting system to work. What Arrow is really showing here is that any voting system can actually be broken, if you will. So Arrow says there's 3 fairness criteria. I actually think these are quite good. The first is that if everyone prefers X to Y, then the group prefers X to Y. 2, if every voter's preferences between X and Y remain unchanged, then the group preference must also remain unchanged. And 3, we don't allow a dictator. That is, we are actually talking about representative governance. It turns out there's no voting system that can consistently, all the time, satisfy these 3 ideas of fairness. To cover that, we get into Arrow's 6 criteria. Now, this is very complex, and so I just want you to get a general idea for what it is that's happening here, and we're not going to delve too much into the particulars. Okay. First is simple non-dictatorship. For a system to even be under criteria, it must be able to satisfy multiple voters. Otherwise, it's not even a voting system. It's just a monarchy, right? Second is what he calls unrestricted domain. This is simply that a voting system has to yield a unique and complete ranking of all choices. So the system actually has to be able to tell what the voting outcome would be, right? If it doesn't yield a unique or complete ranking system, it's not an actual system for choosing because it could leave you in a tie, therefore giving you no outcome, no choice happening. Now, probably the most important one is what we call the independence of irrelevant alternatives, which is to say the preferences between X and Y should depend only on X and Y for the community based on the individual choices. That is, if you and I are trying to decide where to go to lunch with our group of friends and we say, McDonald's or Burger King, and everybody votes, and then somebody says, wait, should we go to Wendy's? And nobody actually prefers Wendy's as their first alternative, then the vote shouldn't change from what it was before. So if a system can add a third alternative, now in the case of Wendy's and McDonald's, maybe that's not super important, right? But in a case of actual voting, we think of third-party candidates having big effects on a two-party system. Not that I'm advocating for two-party systems over three-party systems. I'm merely pointing out that once you add a third-party candidate that can't win, it does sometimes change the outcomes relative to the first two parties. Okay. Fourth is what we call monotonicity. That is, if an individual promotes an option within their rankings, then the community ranking should never lower that option. So it shouldn't be that I prefer something more, but that actually causes that option to become less popular. Fifth is what we call non-imposition. This is every possible community ranking should be achievable by some set of individual preferences. This is somewhat straightforward, right? If you have a situation where there is some possible ranking, so A over B over C, there should be some way that we can combine the individual's preferences to get that outcome. Whether those actually happen in reality or not is immaterial here. We're just saying it should allow for the possibility of any potential combination of rankings. Sixth and finally, we have what's called Pareto efficiency, and this has an important relationship to the previous ones, but it is simply if every individual prefers one option to another, then the community must prefer that option as well. Now, all of these should sound relatively straightforward. They should be the definition of fairness to you, and what Arrow did in his impossibility theorem is show mathematically that there is no system, democracy, republic, there's no system that is representative governance, so not a dictatorship, that can actually satisfy all six criteria at the same time and result in these three ideas of fairness.